Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another edition of our Reach 3030 webinar. This introduction is usually given by our partner Herb Stryker, but today the webinar will be hosted by myself and by my new colleague in Brussels office, Marie Escornebul. So welcome. Today's topic is one substance, one assessment. Next slide, please. So my name is Aleš Bartl. I'm a counsel in Brussels office of Keller and Heckman, and I've been giving these webinars already for more than 2 years. And I'm joined today by my colleague Marie, who, next slide, please. Who joined us recently and who will be giving outline of the main 4 pillars of the initiative. Next slide, please. So as an introduction, probably you have already heard about one substance, one assessment. It has been announced in October 2020 as a part of Chemical Strategy for Sustainability. And the starting point for this initiative is an issue that assessment of chemicals is split between several actors, which leads to inconsistencies, slowness, inefficient use of resources, and unnecessary burdens. So that's why the Commission responded by introducing one substance, one assessment initiative. It will be a package of initiatives. This principle will touch upon several regulatory frameworks and substance-specific legislation. Marie will introduce it a bit later. The goals are simple process and transparency for a more consistent and predictable decision-making. And this initiative will come together with expansion for CLP classes, grouping, restriction for non-essential uses, which all these initiatives are intended to streamline the assessment of chemicals in order to prevent inconsistent regulatory regimes for the same substance. And by inconsistent, I mean that under some regulatory regime substance is allowed, whereas in another substance is not allowed, as we will outline later. Next slide, please. Let's maybe start with introducing how currently the competencies are split between the EU bodies. Next slide, please. So currently, the competencies are allocated by each legislation, by each product-specific or sector-specific legislation in an inconsistent way. So, for example, chemicals hazard and risk assessment is shared between the Commission agencies, such as ECHA. ECHA does not only CLP, REACH, or biocidal product assessment, but also does, for example, environmental and occupational risk assessment. Then we have EFSA, European Food Safety Authority, that deals with food safety, with food contact materials, but also with plant protection products, pesticides. Then we have European Medical Agency, EMA, which deals with medicines. Then we have EU OSHA, which is for occupational safety and worker safety. Then we have European Environmental Agency that is actually currently not doing much. On top of that, we have scientific committees, which are scientific committees of the European Commission, such as SCCS, which stands for Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety. And this is a committee that assesses, for example, cosmetics or nanomaterials. Then we have another committee, SCHER, which deals with, for example, toys, e-cigarettes, waste issues. Again, there is really not reason to split these products between 2 different committees that have different personnel. It's just it's just a of legislation not being streamlined. And then we have several consultants and commission services that also do risk assessment. For example, under ROS, under Restriction of Hazardous Substances in Electrical Equipment, the risk assessment is actually done by external consultant Öko Institute. It has nothing to do with the commission, and it's a private body. Of course, all these bodies address risks from different perspectives, from perspective of use, conditions of use, exposure. Next slide, please. There are already currently some cooperation tools that are intended to streamline assessment. As you probably know, we have activities coordination tool, which is tool managed by ECHA and provides an overview of all planned and ongoing initiatives on chemicals under REACH and CLP. So it's only REACH and CLP at both EU and member state level. And the purpose of ACT list is to avoid duplication of efforts. So that both EU and member state authorities are well informed of what is going on, so that they do not duplicate. And also it's intended to prevent conflicting outcomes. And PACT list, it's a public part actually of this effort, of this list. And the idea is to give registrants an early warning of the substances that are on authorities' radar. So the PACT list or ACT list has been mentioned by the Commission in 2020 as an example to which direction the one substance, one assessment initiative should be headed. Next slide, please. Now I will provide some examples of current assessments that are clearly against the one substance, one assessment principle. First example are plastic food contact materials. For plastic food contact materials is the European Food Safety Authority that gives a green light based on exposure assessment and setting up of migration limits. EFSA can authorize, and often does authorize, a substance that is normally of concern, subject, for example, to very low migration limits, with an argument that the risk is well controlled, and therefore the substance can be authorized. In addition to this, food contact materials are not subject to REACH authorization, even since it's on Annex 14 list. This relates only to health-related endpoints, not to environmental related endpoints. And in addition, food contact materials are exempted from some restrictions. For example, the 4-phthalates, for example, the DHP, that are restricted in REACH have exemption for food contact materials. And actually, these phthalates are authorized in food contact materials, subject to very low migration limits. So this is very clear inconsistency. Next slide, please. Other examples are endocrine disruptors and, for example, titanium dioxide. So these are examples of cases where several entities carry out risk assessment. So endocrine disruptors, it's not a CLP hazard category yet. As you know from our previous webinars, it's very likely going to be a new CLP hazard category. Under REACH, REACH sets out that for endocrine disruptors, it's not possible to derive safe threshold. Under plant protection products and biocide product regulation, there is a ban of endocrine disruptors with some derogations. Then again, under REACH, endocrine disruptors can end up in the SVHC list, but it does not necessarily mean that they are banned under REACH, unlike CMRs. Under food and food contact, they can be used subject to risk-based approach, subject to risk assessment. The same in medical devices, subject to risk-benefit analysis. So again, under average, I'm very different approach. Titanium dioxide received CLP classification as carcinogen 2 in powder form. Very recently, it has been banned as a food additive, but for another endpoint, for genotoxicity concerns. At the same time, it is allowed in medicines and in other applications, such as in toys or in food contact materials. But still, I mean, this will probably change because, for example, as regards medicines, the European Medicinal Agency is looking into alternatives and will probably ban the substance when the alternatives are available, which may be as short in 3 years. Next slide, please. So I just now described how the risk and hazard assessment are done currently. That means in an inconsistent way. I used some examples. And now I'll ask Marie to describe how the one substance, one assessment will probably look like.
Thank you, Alish. Next slide, please. So the One Substance, One Assessment initiative has been represented by the Commission under 4 pillars, as you can visualize on the screen. As Alish mentioned, this initiative comes from the Commission Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, and these pillars were already included in the strategy. So we have initiation, allocation, data, and methodologies that we will detail further on in the presentation. And it's noteworthy that our presentation is also based on some updates in the content of these pillars that were issued, for instance, discussed in Caracal between the Commission and the Member States' competent authorities. And also the Commission presented a seminar on 1st June on the proposal and detailed a bit more its proposal. Next slide, please. So the first pillar is the initiation pillar. As Alish has detailed, currently chemical assessments are being initiated in parallel under various pieces of legislations by various actors at member state, at the EU level, agencies, commission, which generates a lot of complexity and makes it pretty hard for competent authorities to remain informed of what exactly is happening at a point in time. Therefore, the Commission proposes a synchronized and coordinated initiation or triggering of the risk assessment. To do so, the Commission has already set up an expert group, which is a group led by DG Environment, so one of the Commission's Directorate Generals, which includes the agencies that Alish previously mentioned, the Member States' competent authorities, and also members of other Commission directorates to discuss ongoing hazard assessments, ongoing restriction proposals, for instance. But this is pretty informal. The Commission has also announced an intention, as Alish mentioned, to rely on an expansion of the PACT and the ACT tools. So currently they only address REACH and CLP synchronization. The idea is to also encompass other legislations. And the Commission, for instance, has announced its intention to also encompass the food contact material safety assessment, as well as others. Finally, the Commission also aims to ensure that the CLP regulation allows it to initiate itself harmonized classification proposals. So the CLP, as Alish mentioned, is currently under review, so this would be encompassed in it. Currently, only member state competent authorities and also companies may propose harmonized classifications, so this would be another source of proposal. Finally, the Commission is also intending to privilege group assessment. This is also a goal in the CSS as a whole. We see that the Commission is currently considering polymer group grouping, also a PFAS group restriction. So the idea is to, as much as possible, streamline the work and gather what can be gathered to simplify the administrative burden. Next slide, please. Under the allocation pillar, the Commission aims to foster a clear allocation of what it calls the technical and scientific work. This would go through a reallocation of the work performed first at EU level between different EU bodies, moving away from entrusting Commission bodies and external contractors. The Commission has already announced the complete transfer of the competencies of the SCCF and SHARE committees to ECHA. The Commission also, in its presentation of 1st June, has announced its intention to reattribute work from Commission and consultants to ECHA, for instance, ROS, so electronics, persistent organic pollutants, waste framework directive, packaging and packaging waste directive, nanomaterials, toys, chemicals. This is not an exhaustive list. All transferred to ECHA. So ECHA's competence is going to be enlarged quite substantially. And this will be done either by direct inclusion in legislations which are currently under review, REACH, the CLP, the food contact materials regulation, also the cosmetics regulation, for instance, for the SCCS, and also by way of an omnibus regulation, which is an EU legislative instrument which enables the Commission to amend at the same time several legislations. So all the ones cited could be amended with one single instrument. And the Commission expects to issue a legislative proposal by Q4 2022. And the initiative is currently subject to primary consultation. The Commission also aims to strengthen the governance of ECHA by enshrining ECHA's attributions in a single legal document. So ECHA was created through REACH, which defines certain elements of its characteristics, but it was also conferred competencies under CLP regulation, the biocidal products regulation, for instance. So the idea is to gather all these provisions in a single instrument and also to handle ECHA's new attributions as we have seen, they are quite substantive, with also the budget implications, staff implications that this has. And this will be performed by way of a new regulation with a legislative proposal, which is expected by 2023. Next slide, please. Under the third pillar, the data pillar, the Commission first announced the goal to develop a common data platform, which would constitute a single access point to data and information. It isn't clear whether this is intended for decision makers or also for all interested parties, including registrants. But the Commission already announced that it would rely on existing tools and formats. So for instance, generalizing the use of Euclid for hazard and use data, IPChem for monitoring data. And this would also encompass academic data with a goal to make it easily and readily accessible. The Commission, most notably, would also enable EU and national authorities to commission testing and monitoring of substances when further information is considered necessary. In the current state of things, authorities, when they deem that a test and assessment is necessary, will ask the registrant, the applicant, the authorization seeker to itself commission a study and then transmit the study. In this case, authorities would be able to commission their own studies. So this would be a big change from the current exclusivity of the industry. And finally, the Commission also intends to extend the principle of open data, which is currently applicable in the EU food safety sector, to other legislations. So in food, the principle is transparency and the exception is secrecy and confidentiality, whereas, for instance, for REACH, BPR, you have a principle of confidentiality, and that is why you have then data sharing provisions to nevertheless ensure data sharing. This would also be done by an omnibus regulation with a proposal that is expected for Q1, Q2 2023. Next slide, please. Finally, the methodologies pillar. Under the methodologies pillar, the Commission aims to place the CLP regulation as the central piece for hazard classification. So we would have one centralized hazard assessment by ECHA, which would then serve as a basis for risk assessment and limit value setting, which would then be allocated to what the Commission calls the most relevant agency authority. So as we have seen before, for instance, ECHA will get transferred a lot of competences. So it is also in this idea. This would be very impactful for food contact materials and food, as current limit value settings are tied to the specificity of the food contact use. And also the hazard assessment is currently performed within the safety assessment. This would be also backed up by the extension of the CLP hazard classes under the current CLP review. So the creation, for instance, of PBT, VPVB, and ED classes. And these, for instance, for ED classes currently under the BPR and the PPP, there is an ED assessment. And we could imagine that then this ED assessment being already organized through the classification would be covered in the CLP and no longer be needed at a further stage. And other agencies under the scheme would then only be competent for risk assessment. Second, under this pillar, the Commission aims to promote reuse and harmonization of human and environmental health-based limit values. This would be done through a centralized repository, which would encompass, for instance, predicted no-effect concentrations, derived no-effect levels, occupational exposure limit values, maximum total daily intake, for instance. The Commission also aims to foster harmonization through harmonized definitions and notably reviewed the definition of nanomaterial, which is currently scattered across different regimes to ensure a more coherent application across legislations. And all these 4 pillars aim to contribute to the overarching goal of transparency of the EU hazard and risk assessment. Next slide, please. And I leave the floor to Aleš.
Thank you, Mari, for this nice outline. So maybe as concluding remarks, we have some thoughts. So as Mari mentioned, there was a webinar with the Commission on June 1, where the representative of the Commission reiterated that the Commission is pushing for CLP to become the centralized hazard assessment regime, but the Commission downplayed a bit the impact this would have on the risk assessments. One example was used in that presentation, food safety assessment. EFSA should keep its role, which is encouraging in a way, because there were concerns when the initiative, the one substance one assessment initiative was announced. There were concerns that ECHA will basically lose its role, and the assessment would be done entirely by ECHA, and then probably it would be based on hazard rather than on risk. So it looks like it's not going to be that bad. Next slide, please. But this said, we think that EFSA's role will be limited to risk assessment of substances that pass the REACH and CLP test. And we think that there are certain categories that will be showstoppers, that will not even get to EFSA, that will be stopped already at the REACH CLP level. These are the most suspected categories: PBT, VPVB, CMRs, endocrine disruptors, but maybe potentially also the mobile and very mobile substances, neurotoxicants and immunotoxicants. We think really that these categories will actually, for these categories, it will not be possible to assess that the risk is sufficiently controlled in the risk assessment. Also, the allocation of competencies will still need to be clarified, because, for example, the Commission argues that agencies will not lose competencies, but what to do if CLP is a central point that will have, this would already have an impact. We think that despite Commission's statement, there will be overall switch towards hazard assessment to the detriment of risk assessment. I think that the fact that the PACT list that was described earlier in this presentation is still mentioned as the basis for the one substance one assessment is a prediction of this trend, because PACT list, the assessments under REACH and CLP are often, or most of the time, hazard oriented. It will also be important to see how the data let's say, sharing or data collection or data circulation between the agencies, between Commission, and between maybe also registrants and academia will be handled, because this will require change in current data sharing principles, data sharing obligations. For example, if the data have to be exchanged between food contact material regimes and REACH regimes, this will need introduction of a new legislation. So these are our last thoughts. So the main message to take home today is that there will be more streamlined assessment with some hazard categories that will be showstoppers, and that overall the assessment will be inclinated towards hazard assessment, and it will be more difficult, for example, for European Food Safety Authority to justify authorization of a substance for which concern has been identified at the REACH and CLP level. Thank you very much for your attention today. If you have any questions, you can contact us directly, and we'll be happy to address them. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye bye.